Breaking. Just when the Kremlin thought the nightmare couldn't get any worse, the unimaginable has struck. The lifeline connecting Russia to the Baltic trade corridor, once a symbol of Moscow's power in Europe, has been shut down overnight. Hundreds of Russian trucks are now stranded in the freezing dark, engines idling, drivers desperate as NATO nations slam their borders shut. The so-called Baltic Land Bridge, Moscow's last functioning overland supply route to the west, is effectively gone. The first images flooding in are shocking. A sea of headlights stretches for miles near the Russian-Lithuanian border. Satellite shots reveal long convoys of trucks trapped on icy highways, cargo containers piled up at checkpoints, and soldiers pacing nervously along the barricades. Inside Moscow, panic is spreading through logistics companies and ministries as the reality sinks in. The Kremlin just lost one of its final trade arteries to Europe. Just in, sources inside Kaliningrad say warehouses are already overflowing, fuel shipments halted, and even food distribution disrupted, the once bustling transit hub that Russia depended on to move goods between St. Petersburg, Belarus, and the Baltic coast has turned into a dead end. One border guard reportedly described it as the quietest chaos I've ever seen. Nobody's talking, but everyone knows something irreversible just happened. For years, Moscow boasted that its land bridge to the Baltics was unshakable. It was the route that kept Kaliningrad alive, the same path that ferried military equipment, fuel, and consumer goods when sanctions first hit. But now, that route is silent. NATO's sudden decision to freeze crossings from Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia has turned Russia's westernmost enclave into an island, cut off, exposed, and surrounded. In Moscow, officials tried to spin the crisis as a temporary disruption, but their tone gave away the panic behind the scenes. The Ministry of Transport urged calm and patience, yet leaked communications show that fuel reserves in Kaliningrad might last only 3 weeks at current consumption levels. Analysts fear the region could soon face shortages not just of fuel, but of food, medicine, and industrial materials. Meanwhile, footage from the Suwalki corridor, the narrow strip of land between Poland and Lithuania that separates Kaliningrad from Belarus, shows NATO forces mobilizing at an intensity unseen since the Cold War. Armored vehicles line the roads, radar units sweep the skies, and temporary checkpoints have turned into fortified barriers. A senior Lithuanian defense official told reporters, "This is not just about border control. It's about sending a message to Moscow that the Baltic states are no longer open to its games." Back in Russia, truck drivers caught in the chaos describe scenes of desperation. Some have been waiting for days, rationing fuel and food, as border officials deny entry or clearance. One driver shouted to a local camera crew, "They told us to wait, but nobody's coming. We're stuck here between countries, forgotten by both." Another said he was carrying spare parts for military vehicles, now deemed sensitive cargo and confiscated by Lithuanian authorities. Inside the Kremlin, the silence is deafening. Sources close to the Security Council suggest Putin was briefed on the shutdown just hours before it went public. One aide reportedly described the moment as a punch in the gut, the kind of news that changes everything. For decades, Moscow's power projection into Europe relied on physical routes, pipelines, bridges, railways, roads. One by one, they've been severed. First the gas pipelines, then the Black Sea shipping lanes, and now the Baltic link. The shock reverberated through Russian social media. Hashtags like "Oh Kaliningrad blocked" and "Bridge gone" began trending within minutes, before being quietly censored. Independent journalists tried to post footage of trucks stranded near the border, only to see their accounts suspended. But by then, it was too late. The world had already seen the images. What's truly remarkable isn't just the scale of the disruption, but the speed. Within 24 hours, NATO coordination cut off transit routes that Moscow spent decades building. Highways that once symbolized trade and connectivity have become choke points of despair. Analysts say this move didn't come from nowhere. It was the culmination of months of quiet coordination among NATO states after repeated Russian provocations in the Baltic Sea. And that's what makes this moment so dangerous. It's not just about trucks or borders. It's about the message. NATO is done tolerating Moscow's pressure tactics. The shutdown wasn't announced, it was executed. No warning, no negotiation, just action. For Moscow, it was a rude awakening that even its westernmost foothold can be isolated at will. Economically, the implications are enormous. The Baltic route handled over 30% of Russia's overland trade with Europe that remained after sanctions. Cutting it off means thousands of companies lose their access to ports, shipping costs skyrocket, and vital components for Russia's already crippled industries are stranded at the border. The ripple effect will be felt in every corner of the Russian economy, from auto factories in Tatarstan to the energy plants around St. Petersburg. Even inside Russia, state TV couldn't hide the scale of the crisis. Anchors used words like blockade, emergency, and logistical paralysis. Viewers watched grainy drone footage showing hundreds of vehicles stretching into the horizon, while pundits argued whether NATO had crossed a red line. But for most Russians, the images spoke for themselves. Another connection to the world, gone in an instant. And here's the twist nobody saw coming. Reports suggest that the shutdown may have been triggered by intelligence that Russia was moving military hardware disguised as civilian cargo through those same crossings. NATO had warned for months that Moscow was testing the alliance's borders with suspicious shipments. If that's true, the blockade wasn't just retaliation, it was prevention. As night falls over the stranded convoys, one thing becomes clear. Moscow's Baltic dream is collapsing. The same bridge that symbolized connection now marks isolation. The last flicker of Russia's trade artery with Europe has been extinguished under the shadow of NATO's flags. But what pushed the alliance to act now? What intelligence tipped the balance? And how could Russia, with all its power, fail to see this coming? Those are the questions the Kremlin doesn't want anyone asking, but we will, because this move didn't happen in a vacuum. Something much bigger is unfolding behind closed doors, and the full story might be even more devastating for Moscow than anyone realizes. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear next will expose the hidden strategy that brought the Baltic blockade to life, and why it might mark the beginning of a new phase in this war that Russia cannot win. It started quietly. No airstrikes, no declarations, no speeches. Just one morning, the roads were closed. Border gates that had been open for decades were suddenly sealed shut, steel barriers lowered, cameras turned on, and NATO patrols stationed every few hundred meters. For Moscow, this was not a military assault. It was something far more calculated. A surgical chokehold. The Baltic Land Bridge had been Russia's silent artery for years, running through Belarus, Lithuania, and into the Kaliningrad enclave. It was Moscow's only stable lifeline to the Baltic Sea after sanctions crippled its other trade routes. It carried everything: food, spare parts, gas, electronics, ammunition. Now it carries nothing but silence. According to multiple European sources, NATO's intelligence network had been tracking suspicious cargo convoys along that corridor for weeks. Unmarked trucks, odd nighttime crossings, unusual military escorts. When the Lithuanian government quietly alerted Brussels that these shipments might contain missile components disguised as industrial machinery, the response was immediate. Within hours, the North Atlantic Council authorized a regional emergency coordination order. The result? An unannounced lockdown of every crossing from Russia into the Baltics. To the outside world, it looked sudden, but this operation was months in the making. NATO's Logistics Command had been preparing contingency plans since midsummer, after drone footage revealed Russian military buildup near Kaliningrad. It wasn't an overreaction, it was a preemptive containment maneuver, a move designed to strangle any chance of escalation before it reached NATO soil. As trucks piled up at border points, Moscow's transport ministry sent urgent cables to Vilnius and Riga demanding explanations. None came. Instead, a terse statement from NATO's European Command arrived. Due to elevated security concerns, transnational movement along Baltic corridors has been temporarily suspended. Behind that cold, bureaucratic phrase was a geopolitical earthquake. Because this isn't just about trade, it's about control. For years, Russia used its geographic reach to pressure neighbors, threaten transit, and test NATO's patience. The Baltic Land Bridge was Moscow's symbol of persistence, the proof that despite isolation, Russia could still connect with Europe. Now, that symbol has been shattered. Inside the Kremlin, panic spread fast. Sources claim Putin convened an emergency midnight meeting with top generals, transport officials, and energy ministers. One witness said the atmosphere was electric with anger. Maps were projected across the Situation Room, showing red lines where border routes had gone dark. Find an alternative. Putin reportedly snapped, but there was none. Every legal crossing from Russia into NATO territory was sealed. Even Belarus, once Moscow's obedient vassal, began showing hesitation. Lukashenko's administration issued a vague statement calling for dialogue, but refused to reopen routes unilaterally. The reason? Fear. Fear of becoming the next target of NATO's tightening grip. Meanwhile, Russian state TV scrambled to shift the narrative. Anchors claimed technical maintenance was behind the closures, while independent trucker networks posted videos online showing military barricades and NATO flags. The lie collapsed within hours. Telegram channels erupted in fury. "We're trapped! They're strangling us! Where is Moscow?" At the same time, European reporters stationed in border regions described a surreal calm. The air buzzed with drone surveillance, but there were no gunshots, no protests, no violence. Just a steady hum of engines and wind as Russian convoys sat motionless. It was a war of silence, and NATO was winning it without firing a single bullet. According to one Lithuanian defense insider, this was about leverage. Moscow has used Kaliningrad to threaten us for years. Missiles, troops, intimidation. Now we control Kaliningrad's breathing. One turn of the valve and the region suffocates. What's astonishing is how quickly the move rippled through Russia's logistics network. By the second day, major freight companies began halting deliveries. Insurance premiums skyrocketed. Rail shipments from Belarus to St. Petersburg dropped by half. Kaliningrad's fuel depots issued ration warnings. Within 72 hours, Russia's entire Western logistics spine began to seize. Economic analysts in Europe call it a silent blockade. There are no warships, no sanctions, no official declarations, just a bureaucratic freeze that grinds Moscow's arteries into paralysis. And unlike a bombing campaign, there's no clear enemy to strike back at. NATO can claim it's simply protecting border integrity, but everyone knows the truth. This was payback. The timing couldn't be worse for Moscow. With oil prices fluctuating, sanctions biting deeper, and internal dissent spreading, the last thing the Kremlin needed was another choke point. Yet that's exactly what it got. Businesses across Russia began sounding the alarm. Supply chains broken, exports frozen, ports idled. In Kaliningrad, supermarkets reportedly began rationing sugar and flour. Lines formed at gas stations. The panic is spreading faster than the government can contain it. Russian propaganda tried to project strength, airing footage of alternative routes through Belarus and the Arctic. But logistics experts quickly debunked those claims. The distances are longer, cost higher, and infrastructure inadequate. You can't replace the Baltic Bridge, said one Western analyst. It was the spine of Russia's Western economy. Break it, and you break Moscow's grip on Europe. And then, something unexpected happened. Whispers of defiance began emerging from within Russia's trucking industry. Videos appeared showing drivers abandoning their vehicles, walking away from convoys that had been ordered to wait indefinitely. One driver from Smolensk shouted into his phone, "They told us to serve the motherland, but the motherland forgot us." That clip went viral before state media could erase it. Western analysts are calling this a new kind of warfare. Logistical strangulation, and it doesn't require armies or missiles, just coordination and timing, and NATO has mastered both. By closing a few key crossings, it has achieved what years of sanctions could not. Visible, undeniable paralysis inside Russia's own territory. One senior NATO official described it bluntly, off record. "This is what modern deterrence looks like. We didn't invade, we isolated. And isolation hurts more than bombs." But to truly grasp the magnitude of what's unfolding, you have to see it from Moscow's side. Inside government buildings, the silence is suffocating. Ministers shuffle papers, trying to calculate how long they can sustain Kaliningrad without overland supply. The defense ministry quietly moved additional airlift units to ferry supplies, but capacity is limited. Within 2 weeks, the enclave could be running on fumes. The Kremlin's messaging machine is now in full spin, blaming NATO aggression and promising retaliation. Yet every retaliation option comes with a risk Moscow can't afford. Attack NATO directly and risk escalation. Do nothing and appear weak. Either way, Putin is cornered, and this is where it becomes truly dangerous. Desperate regimes make desperate moves. Russia may try to retaliate with cyber attacks, disinformation, or provocations along the border, but NATO seems prepared. Military activity along the Suwalki Gap has doubled, and American reconnaissance planes are patrolling the region non-stop. The alliance knows Moscow is unpredictable when humiliated, and this humiliation cuts deep. So what's next? Is the Baltic blockade just an isolated move, or the opening act of a wider plan to economically crush Russia's western flank? Because if NATO can shut down one land bridge, what stops them from cutting the others? To Belarus, to China, to the Caucasus. Could this be the strategy that finally collapses Moscow's logistics network altogether? In the next part, we'll uncover what intelligence actually triggered this unprecedented lockdown, and why insiders believe the operation was planned as part of a broader strategy to break Russia's influence over the Baltic region once and for all. Stay with me, because this is where the story takes a turn from crisis to containment. It began as a border lockdown, but within days, the shockwaves from NATO's Baltic blockade rippled through the entire Russian system like a tremor before an earthquake. Supply chains buckled, trade routes froze, and something even more dangerous began to happen. The illusion of control inside the Kremlin started to crack. What was meant to be a simple border security measure has turned into the most devastating economic choke Moscow has faced since the start of the war. As the first week passed, satellite footage showed the fallout spreading far beyond the Baltic corridor. Rail yards from Pskov to Smolensk stood eerily still. Containers piled high along freight terminals, their shipments now worthless. Truck lines on the Kaliningrad highway turned into makeshift camps, smoke rising from small fires as stranded drivers huddled against the cold. For Moscow, this isn't just a logistics issue, it's a psychological defeat, because the Baltic Land Bridge was never just a trade route, it was a lifeline of pride, a symbol that despite sanctions, despite isolation, Russia could still connect with Europe. Now that bridge is gone, and with it, a piece of the Kremlin's myth of resilience, and NATO knows it. Inside Brussels, sources say the operation was celebrated quietly as a strategic success. Officials described it as a demonstration of NATO's ability to reshape the battlefield without firing a shot, and one insider put it more bluntly. Moscow thought it could outlast us economically. We just proved that we can strangle them whenever we choose. The mood in Moscow couldn't be more different. Panic is seeping through ministries like a virus. The Transport Ministry has stopped issuing public statements. The Energy Ministry is rationing diesel exports to preserve domestic reserves. And in Kaliningrad, once the jewel of Russia's western frontier, empty shelves and fuel shortages have become daily reality. A leaked memo from the local administration reportedly warned Moscow that civil unrest could erupt within weeks if the blockade continues. Even the military isn't spared. Intelligence reports suggest that units stationed in Kaliningrad are running low on essential supplies. Tires, fuel additives, food stocks. NATO's decision to seal the land routes effectively trapped thousands of soldiers behind an invisible wall. One Western analyst called it the perfect siege without siege weapons. Meanwhile, across the Baltic Sea, NATO allies are tightening the net. Sweden, Finland, Poland, and the Baltic states have all ramped up surveillance and troop readiness. Convoys of armored vehicles patrol highways once used by Russian freight. In Vilnius, government buildings glow through the night as analysts monitor satellite feeds. The message is clear. The Baltics are no longer a transit zone. They're a barrier. What's truly fascinating is how the world's financial centers are reacting. European markets barely flinched, while the ruble nosedived overnight. Investors read the blockade as a sign that Russia's economic isolation is deepening and irreversible. Western shipping firms immediately halted routes involving Russian cargo, while global insurers classified Russian ground logistics as high risk. Within 72 hours, over $1 billion in trade evaporated. Inside the Kremlin, Putin's advisors reportedly begged him to de-escalate, to open back-channel talks through Turkey or Hungary, but the president's reaction, according to a senior source, was fury. They think they can cut us off, he was quoted as saying. We'll show them what happens when Russia is cornered. Those words sent chills across diplomatic circles, because history has shown what happens when the Kremlin feels humiliated. And indeed, retaliation began, but not on the battlefield. Russia's cyber units went into overdrive. Within days, government websites in Lithuania and Latvia were hit with massive denial-of-service attacks. Banks and infrastructure agencies went offline temporarily, though NATO's Cyber Command quickly countered. The message was obvious. If Russia can't move its trucks, it will move its warfare into cyberspace. But that wasn't enough to mask the humiliation. Russian state media doubled down on propaganda, showing old footage of full store shelves and smooth highways, trying to project normalcy. Yet on social platforms, the truth leaked out. Videos of families in Kaliningrad standing in long queues for groceries. Reports of factories halting production because spare parts never arrived. Hashtags like Baltic Blockade and Kaliningrad starves began trending despite heavy censorship. Then came the unexpected twist. Voices of dissent inside Russia's own elite, prominent oligarchs already strained by sanctions, started warning privately that the country's economic structure could collapse if the blockade remained. One even told a Western outlet anonymously, "This isn't a border issue, it's the slow death of our trade arteries, and the leadership refuses to admit it." For the first time, fractures appeared, not among protesters, but among Putin's inner circle. Meanwhile, the international response has been telling. Washington called the blockade a regional decision by NATO members for security reasons, but make no mistake, the US knew and approved. London praised the Baltics for their decisive action to safeguard European security. In Berlin, officials quietly acknowledged that this was a turning point. Europe is no longer reacting to Moscow's aggression, it's dictating the tempo. Even China, Russia's supposed ally, responded with calculated distance. Beijing's foreign ministry issued a lukewarm statement calling for dialogue and restraint. But behind closed doors, Chinese firms began suspending logistics partnerships with Russian companies. The signal couldn't be clearer. When the heat rises, Russia stands alone. As the blockade drags on, experts warn of an impending humanitarian crisis in Kaliningrad. Food and fuel are running low. Hospitals are rationing medical supplies. Ferry routes from St. Petersburg are overloaded and vulnerable. The Russian military has begun airlifting small amounts of cargo, but those planes can't sustain an entire region. It's a matter of time, one European intelligence source said. Kaliningrad will choke, and Moscow will have to choose between escalation or surrender. The psychological toll is immense. Russian citizens who once believed state promises of strength now see only scarcity and silence. Television broadcasts blur into propaganda, but people know the truth. Their world is shrinking, one border at a time. And this isn't just economic warfare, it's symbolic. The Baltic blockade shows that Russia's power projection is fading. Its once mighty logistics empire has been reduced to isolated pockets of control. Every route west is blocked, every corridor sealed, every handshake replaced by a wall. For the Kremlin, this crisis strikes at its most sensitive nerve, the fear of irrelevance. For decades, Moscow's strength rested on the idea that Europe needed it for gas, for trade, for transit. That myth has just been obliterated. Europe has moved on, NATO has closed the door, and Russia, for all its threats, is standing outside in the cold. But this story isn't over. Far from it. Because as Moscow scrambles to find a way out, new intelligence suggests this blockade might only be the first phase of a far larger strategy, one designed not just to isolate Russia's trade routes, but to dismantle its geopolitical influence piece by piece. If that's true, then what's coming next could reshape the balance of power across Eastern Europe. How far is NATO willing to go, and how much more can Moscow lose before it breaks? Stay tuned, because in the next part, we'll uncover how the Kremlin's attempts to retaliate backfired catastrophically, and how the blockade triggered a chain reaction that may push Russia into a crisis it can't control. Desperation. That's the only word that can describe the atmosphere inside Moscow right now. The once calculated silence of the Kremlin has turned into restless chaos. Closed meetings, frantic phone calls, officials barking orders that lead nowhere. The Baltic blockade, what Putin's advisors dismissed as a temporary inconvenience, has exploded into a full-scale national emergency, and what came next was not Moscow's retaliation, it was Moscow's implosion. At first, Putin's inner circle tried to hit back hard. The plan was simple. If NATO closed the gates, Russia would make Europe feel the pain. Energy blackmail, cyber strikes, trade disruptions. But one by one, those attempts collapsed. The revenge operation became a humiliating display of weakness. The Kremlin's first move was to weaponize gas again. Russia ordered an immediate reduction of gas flows through pipelines running into Eastern Europe. But this time, Europe didn't blink. Years of diversification had paid off. LNG terminals in Poland and Finland ramped up supplies overnight. US tankers rerouted to meet demand, and within 48 hours, Moscow's bluff had failed. The price spike lasted only a day before falling back. In short, Russia had lost its last economic weapon. Next came the cyber attacks. Massive waves of digital strikes hit Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia simultaneously. Banks, media outlets, and even airport systems went dark. But within hours, NATO's Cyber Defense Command responded with surgical precision. Servers were isolated, breaches patched, and Russian IPs blacklisted. The attempted retaliation fizzled, leaving Moscow looking desperate and impotent. The final act of defiance was supposed to be symbolic, a massive military convoy moving toward the Suwalki Gap, the thin stretch of land connecting Kaliningrad to Belarus. Russian media broadcast footage of armored vehicles rolling out, dust clouds rising, commanders shouting orders. But then, within a day, the footage disappeared. Satellite images later revealed the truth. The convoy was nothing more than a staged show. Most of those vehicles never left the depot. Even the soldiers weren't fooled. Reports from within Russian units describe growing mutiny and confusion. One officer admitted anonymously, "They're sending us to defend supply lines that no longer exist." What are we even fighting for? That single quote, posted online for mere minutes before being deleted, encapsulated the reality of Russia's new war, a war of exhaustion, not expansion. Meanwhile, the blockade continued to tighten. Lithuania extended its restrictions, Latvia banned dual-use goods, and Poland deployed new border drones. NATO logistics aircraft patrolled the skies non-stop, ready for any hint of escalation. The message was crystal clear. Moscow's threats no longer inspire fear. They invite laughter. And that laughter is echoing inside Russia itself. Across major cities, the economic fallout is becoming impossible to hide. Supermarkets in Kaliningrad stand half empty. Construction projects in St. Petersburg have halted due to a lack of imported materials. Small manufacturers from Smolensk to Bryansk are shuttering their doors. The blockade has strangled the arteries feeding Russia's Western economy, and the Kremlin has no backup plan. Worse yet, Russia's oligarchs are turning on each other. With trade collapsing and assets frozen, powerful businessmen are clawing for survival. Two major logistics magnates reportedly fled the country after being accused of economic sabotage. One of them, according to leaked FSB memos, was planning to defect to Finland. The paranoia inside Moscow's elite circles has reached Cold War levels. Phones tapped, homes raided, generals interrogated. The once mighty Kremlin looks more like a cornered animal than a government in control. Internationally, Russia's allies are watching in silence, and some are backing away. China's shipping companies have quietly suspended all deliveries through Russian ports, citing unreliable transit conditions. India's oil buyers are demanding higher discounts to compensate for rising geopolitical risks. Even Belarus, Moscow's last remaining satellite, has begun limiting traffic from Russian suppliers. It's the unthinkable. Russia's being cut off by its own friends. And NATO? It's not slowing down. Inside Brussels, a new phrase is circulating among defense analysts. Containment by logistics. The idea is simple. Instead of confronting Russia on the battlefield, isolate it economically until its military becomes a stranded machine without fuel or parts. And right now, that strategy is working perfectly. European officials have even started discussing Phase 2 of the plan, expanding the blockade to include selective maritime restrictions in the Baltic Sea under the pretext of environmental safety. No, it's a diplomatic trick with devastating potential. If executed, Moscow's Kaliningrad enclave could lose not just its land routes, but its sea lanes as well. That would be the final nail in the coffin. Inside Russia, that realization is triggering panic among the population. Truck drivers trapped at the borders have started abandoning their vehicles. Local police report rising theft and vandalism in makeshift truck camps. Families are selling belongings to buy food as prices soar. For the first time in decades, Russians are experiencing the feeling their grandparents once knew: blockade, isolation, scarcity. And through it all, Putin remains silent. His recent televised address was brief and bitter. He blamed NATO for economic terrorism and promised decisive countermeasures. But his face said it all: tired, cornered, humiliated. The image of the strongman has cracked. The war he once commanded is now commanding him. Western observers are calling it the reverse siege. Russia, once the aggressor, is now the one trapped inside its own borders. Every move it makes is countered, every threat neutralized, every path closed. It's a slow suffocation, no explosions, no grand battles, just the relentless tightening of the noose. But perhaps the most remarkable consequence of this blockade isn't what's happening at the borders, it's what's happening inside the Russian psyche. For years, propaganda convinced the population that the West needed Russia, that Europe couldn't function without Russian power. Now they're witnessing the opposite. Europe is thriving and Russia is struggling to breathe. That realization is spreading faster than any virus. From Kaliningrad to Moscow, whispers of discontent are turning into open anger. Workers unpaid, soldiers undersupplied, families hungry. Protests, small but growing, are emerging in provincial cities. Chants of enough echo in places once loyal to the regime. The Kremlin can censor videos, but it cannot censor hunger. As the fourth week of the blockade begins, intelligence intercepts reveal something unprecedented. Internal rifts inside the Russian military command. Generals blaming ministers, ministers blaming oligarchs, oligarchs blaming Putin. The foundation of the Russian system, the unity of fear, is crumbling, and that's when NATO made its next move. A quiet but powerful statement from the alliance's Secretary General: the security of our borders is non-negotiable. Russia's actions brought this isolation upon itself. Those words hit Moscow harder than any missile, because for the first time in decades, NATO didn't sound defensive, it sounded victorious. The story of the Baltic blockade isn't over, it's evolving. What began as a regional shutdown has become a symbol of Russia's unraveling. Each passing day, the crisis deepens, the isolation spreads, and the Kremlin's grip weakens. But the question now is, how far will Moscow go to break this siege? Will it lash out militarily, risking all-out confrontation? Or will it implode from within, under the weight of its own failures? In the final part, we'll uncover how the Kremlin's desperation may lead to one of the most dangerous gambles in modern history, and how NATO's silent strategy could end not just the land bridge, but the illusion of Russian dominance itself. Stay with me, because the next chapter could mark the breaking point of Putin's entire regime. The Kremlin has gone quiet, not the confident kind of silence that comes from control, but the hollow, suffocating quiet that fills the air when power starts to crumble. The Baltic blockade has entered its fifth week, and what was once dismissed as a temporary inconvenience has mutated into a full-blown national paralysis. Moscow's trade has withered, its western lifeline is gone. The so-called Baltic Land Bridge, the artery that once pumped goods, fuel, and pride into Russia's western flank, is now nothing more than a memory buried under a mountain of failure. New satellite footage paints a grim picture. Endless convoys of abandoned Russian trucks stretching through Lithuania's forests, rusting containers filled with spoiled food, stranded fuel tankers leaking into frozen soil. From above, they look like tombstones, each one marking another nail in Moscow's geopolitical coffin. What began as a logistical crisis has turned into a symbol of collapse. Russia has been cut off, not by bombs, not by armies, but by precision, coordination, and the quiet ruthlessness of NATO's strategy. In Kaliningrad, the situation is dire. Residents whisper that the shelves are empty, hospitals are rationing supplies, and factories stand silent. A local engineer told an independent reporter, "We used to be Russia's window to Europe. Now we're its prison cell. Fuel is being guarded by armed patrols. Food deliveries arrive under military escort." The once bustling port, where cargo ships once danced across the Baltic waters, now lies still, a graveyard of cranes and idle ships under a gray, unending sky. And in Moscow, panic has turned to despair. The Kremlin's response has shifted from defiance to delusion. Officials talk about alternative corridors, but there are none. Every route west is sealed. The Belarus crossing is under NATO surveillance. The northern Arctic rail link, frozen and impossible for mass transport. The southern lines through Ukraine, gone long ago. Russia is boxed in, its empire of connections now reduced to a fortress of isolation. Inside Putin's war cabinet, the atmosphere is tense and fractured. Intelligence leaks from Western agencies describe heated arguments between generals and ministers. One general reportedly shouted, "We can't even feed Kaliningrad. How can we fight NATO?" Another warned that if the blockade continues, Russian troops in the enclave will have to start rationing fuel within days. That kind of language, once unthinkable inside the Kremlin, now echoes across its marble halls. The West, meanwhile, has tightened the vice with chilling precision. The European Union quietly expanded sanctions to target Russian logistics networks directly. Insurance firms, port companies, rail consortia, ships carrying Russian cargo now face days of inspection delays, while NATO naval patrols shadow every Russian vessel crossing the Baltic Sea. Even neutral Sweden, which once avoided confrontation, is now fully aligned with the alliance's containment strategy. The circle is closing, and Moscow knows it. But what's perhaps most devastating for the Kremlin isn't the physical blockade, it's the psychological one. For decades, Russia has built its identity on power, dominance, the illusion that it could bend its neighbors through fear. That illusion has shattered. Every truck stranded at the border, every empty port in Kaliningrad, every idle factory in Smolensk is a reminder that fear no longer works. The world has moved past Moscow's threats, and yet there's a new danger rising from within. The blockade has become the spark for something far more dangerous than sanctions or isolation: civil unrest. Across the Russian heartland, small protests are growing. In Kaliningrad, angry citizens confronted local officials, shouting, "We're starving while you hide in bunkers." In Moscow, videos show drivers marching toward government offices demanding answers. These aren't the organized protests of the past. They're raw, desperate, and fueled by hunger. Even inside the elite, loyalty is unraveling. The oligarchs who once financed the Kremlin's ambitions are now watching their fortunes vanish. Factories closed, accounts frozen, deals canceled. Some have started moving assets abroad, quietly, discreetly, fearing what's coming next. One source close to the energy sector described it perfectly. The rats are leaving the ship before it sinks. Meanwhile, in the West, NATO's tone has shifted from cautious to confident. What was once a defensive alliance is now a force of quiet dominance. European leaders speak of strategic containment as if it's the new normal. Washington applauds the Baltic states for their unwavering courage. Every move is deliberate, every statement measured. NATO doesn't need to fire a single shot. The battlefield is economic, psychological, and entirely on Moscow's doorstep, and this is where the story reaches its breaking point. Because according to multiple intelligence reports, Putin is preparing his most dangerous move yet, a desperate gambit to break the blockade through force. Troop movements have been detected near the Belarusian border, long-range artillery repositioned, military aircraft refueled and ready. But NATO has already anticipated this. Reinforcements from Poland, Finland, and the US have been quietly deployed. Satellite data shows NATO radar coverage now blankets the entire Baltic region. The alliance is daring Moscow to make the first move, knowing full well it would be a suicide mission. Inside the Kremlin, paranoia reigns. Advisors whisper that Putin's isolation is complete, not just from the West, but from his own people. His closest allies avoid eye contact. Rumors swirl that several senior officials have quietly fled the country. One Western diplomat summarized it in chilling terms. He built a fortress to protect himself from the world. Now that fortress has become his cage. Kaliningrad, once Moscow's western outpost of strength, now stands as the perfect metaphor for Russia itself. Isolated, encircled, starving for relevance. Every passing day without relief erodes what little legitimacy the Kremlin has left. Western analysts are already calling it the beginning of the end. But history has shown one thing about regimes on the brink: they don't go quietly, and that's what terrifies the world tonight, because a wounded, humiliated Russia is the most unpredictable version of all. Will Putin risk open confrontation with NATO, or will he turn his rage inward, purging his own government to maintain the illusion of control? Either path leads to chaos. As night falls over Moscow, the city glows not with celebration, but with anxiety. Gasoline prices surge, supermarket shelves thin, whispers of rationing spread through the streets. The propaganda still blares on television, promising victory, but nobody's listening anymore. The illusion is gone. The land bridge is gone. The empire is slipping away. And somewhere in the Kremlin, a man sits alone in a gilded office, staring at the map of Europe that no longer bends to his will. The Baltic borderlines that once symbolized opportunity now form a cage around his ambitions. The roads that once led west now end in silence. The Baltic Land Bridge, once Moscow's pride, is dead. NATO didn't bomb it, didn't invade it, didn't even announce it. They simply closed the door and waited. And now, as that door slams shut, the echo will haunt Russia for generations, because this wasn't just the loss of a route. It was the loss of an empire's last connection to the world. So what happens next? Will the Kremlin lash out, or will the silence finally break from within? Will Russia find a way to rise, or has it crossed the point of no return? Tell me what you think. Is this the moment history will remember as the day Moscow's ambitions died? Leave your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because this story is far from over. New developments are coming fast, and in the next video, we'll dive into how NATO's containment strategy is expanding beyond the Baltics, into the Arctic, the Black Sea, and beyond. The world is changing, and the Kremlin knows it.